Thank you for joining us. I'm Gord Long. As is always, it's my pleasure to have back with me today Charles Hugh Smith, well-followed and prolific writer on the web, who is the publisher of the website of2minds.com. Welcome back, Charles.
Thank you, Gordon. It's a pleasure to be with you on our part 3 of our series.
Charles, before we begin, I need to stress with our new viewers that this is not an interview. We do these videos as a way of us productively dialoguing the important trends we are identifying and simply make our discussion available to the public. For those that might be interested or want to contribute constructive comments, because we really do welcome the comments, because they really give us some great insights and further expand on some of the thinking that we'll go through, for example, today. These sessions help me personally crystallize my macro investment themes while helping Charles with his very, very broad research writing efforts. So today, in part 3 of our series on the emerging era of political and social conflict, as in the last session, I will be primarily leading us through our slides, and Charles will be commenting as we go. Anything you'd like to add on our process, Charles, before we begin?
No, it's that'll be that's our process, and I think that we're always early, and so I would just caution readers: don't look for all these trends to manifest tomorrow, but look to them to manifest over the next 2 to 3, 4, 5 years.
Typically, we're 2 years ahead of when we're talking about something actually occurring. That, I think, is our experience over the last 10 years, right, Charles?
Yeah.
For sometimes we think it's more imminent, but it always seems it takes a lot longer. So we have a significant number of slides to share, maybe even too many, which I'll apologize in advance. I will therefore move along quickly. So let's just jump right in. As I said, this is part 3 and the final installment of this series. In part 3, we will address what the investment concerns and opportunities will be for the coming era of global conflict that we laid out previously. We'll not be discussing specific investment themes in this session due to time, but rather refer you to a just released Mata SII Under the Lens video, which delves deeper in this regard as a result of this video series, and our recent Mata SII 2020 thesis paper entitled Global Conflict, which you can sign up for at Mata SII for your free copy when it is released to the public, as it's currently only a subscriber content. We are springboarding from our prior videos, What's Holding the Market Up, and Part 1, Macro Messages. In the second session, we discussed the new weapons of financial, economic, and political conflict. All these videos can be found at the on the Gordon T. Long YouTube channel. So with that, on to part 3. So what did we learn in part 1 and 2? We have slowing real rate of growth, real rate of economic growth, the beginning of an era of intensifying chaos and conflict. That will come with it completely new weapons of conflict, both hard weapons and soft weapons in various forms we laid out. And but what will come with it is an extremely bad cocktail mix of financial, economic, political, and social strife. And as we also mentioned, inevitably, it comes with a stability test. We haven't had that in a long time. And since we've had economies in existence, they're over some period of time, they're always retested to find out if they're stable, not by design and by mandate. They just happen when something starts to break somewhere. And does the system self-correct? Does it catch it? Does it adjust? And that and the understanding we learned in these previous videos that conflict is always financial, and if we follow the money, we can usually start to find out what the trends are going to be, or as I said, the opportunities or the concerns that we need to be watching out for. Comments on any of those, that recap, Charles?
Just that what we're talking about is a massive trend change. In other words, the next 5 years are not going to be the sort of stability that we saw in the previous 5 years. So we're looking for a generational change, and that's one of the topics that we're going to talk about today.
What we did not discuss in part 1 and 2 is the situational analysis that this era of conflict that we laid out rests on. And what it rests on is and we've talked about this in many previous videos, right, Charles, over the years, but a historic debt and leverage levels we've never seen before. It's resting on these changes of era of conflict, on a fragile and unbalanced global economy. It's dramatically distorted between debt and those with strong economies and those with heavy entitlements, etc., and the overall end of the debt supercycle. A debt supercycle, which is, in my mind, of historic proportions, which the Kondratiev long wave shown here suggests we should have already entered it in terms of what they refer to as in the long wave the winter stage, a stage that has been extended by artificial and dangerous, and I stress that in my opinion, dangerous monetary policy, a stage that matches and correlates with many other long wave cycles, as I show here, all headed to cycle lows during the early part of the 20s. There's just so many things that are coming together here for this period of this era of conflict to be laid over as a situational analysis. And if you feel like some of us older guys do, that things are just getting bizarre, this is why. Here is why it is. But there is more than this, if there could be, and there is, and probably more dangerously important. And that is that the U.S. dollar as the global reserve currency and the U.S. Treasury note and bonds as the global risk-free benchmark are simply said, or if I can make it simple, are in trouble and will be in the 2020s. And this is the pillars that the global economic system is currently built on or works off of. We laid out a lot of this at MAT-SII in last year's 2019 thesis paper entitled De-Dollarization. And this chart here shows from that converging pressures from fiscal waves of debt and debt saturation will soon start pincing pressures and weakening these two global financial pillars. And I encourage you, we don't have time today to read this, about 111-page document that's available free at MAT-SII, but will really show you how these things, the potential damage can happen with any minor weakness in either the U.S. dollar or the U.S. bonds and debt instruments. Comments on that, Charles?
Yeah, Gordon, I just want to insert that you and I have often talked about over the years that this is not a one-way process. In other words, as the global economy comes under pressure from a variety of sources, that the dollar, just like the yen, the Japanese yen, these are like, quote, safe haven currencies. So they could actually go up. In like a global recession or a financial crisis, but that is that temporary sort of increase in purchasing power would be temporary. It wouldn't be negating the long wave trends that you just described.
Yes, exactly. In simple terms, to me, what does all this mean? It means that the financial system is now resting on leveraged debt that increasingly has insufficient secured collateral to sustain itself from either massive levels of debt rollover or new debt required to support highly leveraged CLOs and zombie corporations, etc., which in themselves are indications of the seriousness of what's going on. Something called, and we won't get into it, but we've spelled out before, something called rehypothecation has reached its endgame. And banks, as the recent last fall's repo crisis clearly illustrated, can no longer trust other global banks, and most critically, the shadow banks themselves, their collateral. There's a distrust of the value of the collateral and a growing shortage of new unpledged or rehypothecated collateral. We now live in a new world of structured finance. We all know that involves, but what you may not be familiar with, that involves such terms as collateral transformations to effectively bandage or rig the system. As this chart shows, we're set up for another 2008 crisis in a different form, but if you look at the chart, it's only the names, frankly, that have changed, and some new methodology of pushing out more credit and more leverage. You know, the old game of borrowing short and lending long that the banks and all the lending institutions are now built on, not the old days where you borrowed long and lent short. But it only continues to work when there's plenty of two bonding agents, liquidity and trust. And both have become potential problems in different regards. Tenuous problems which the whole global financial system depends on. We're pumping out liquidity, but how long will the trust be there, and what will break it? And the worse the problems get, that is, with this era of global conflict and financial disruptions, the more the creative financial system is forced to react. And as example here, we've now got things called collateral swaps. And there are more things. I'm just picking on some of these terminologies now that are really broad-based, that never really see the day of the light of day to the public, but they're undermining or keeping the whole financial system going right now. And because frankly, the distortions have become too big to handle. And let me put that into context, and I hope this chart here kind of does. We now have an unregulated, over-the-counter, $500 trillion swaps market in currency and interest swaps, according to the Bank of International Settlements. The two pillars that I just mentioned of the global financial market, that's what this is about. They rest on the U.S. bonds, and as in terms of interest swaps, and on currencies. Those are the U.S. dollar. That's the benchmark that's being used. This temporarily is supporting the global economy that only approximates $80 trillion in total. This is a massive distortion, and it won't take much to cause problems. So something has to give. And I like this chart because either the swaps market collapses, that here's under its own weight, that is shown here, like coming from the right, tips over, this massive size of it, or from something small over here on the left that destabilizes it and brings the whole thing down. We don't know. It's irrelevant, but this distortion can't sustain itself, not just because of this graphic picture and the size of it, but because what's underpinning these pillars that are underpinning it. The well-recognized Exeter collateral pyramid has long stood the test of time during periods of turmoil and instability, and according to the Exeter's model, those derivatives with the weakest and the furthest links from base money, that is the ones here on the top, are the first to be rejected and potentially bankrupted. As confidence vanishes and a broad-based liquidation process ensues, the higher risk asset class values cascade and collapse towards their underlying real collateral value. And we get down to what is real value and real wealth. We're well advanced in the well-established fiat currency cycle shown here, which has never ended, but in one and only one way, with collapse. That's a long ways out. Well, maybe not, but is further out than these other issues that I've just described. Comments, Charles? They're a little long-winded, but I didn't give you a chance to interrupt me there. But comments? Anything I've said there so far?
No, I'm glad you brought it back to the ultimate crisis that we're talking about, which is the loss of purchasing power and trust in fiat currencies. And I would just sort of summarize what you were describing about the erosion of collateral, if you will, is we've talked about the process of financialization, and that's really sort of the context here of, and in my mind, understanding what you're describing about collateral is financialization is a process where it takes once secure assets, like say homes, right? And then it turns it into a financial instrument that can then be detached from the reality of the real world, and then and traded, and a pyramid of debt and leverage can be built on it. And so that's what we saw in the 2007-8 crisis, was subprime mortgages, which were based on real world homes, but they were then detached from reality and turned into financial instruments that could be sold globally. And they were detached from the actual value of the underlying collateral. And so that's one way to understand what you've described. Is that's true of virtually the entire global financial sector now, that everything has been detached from reality, and it trades in its own little netherworld of finance. And that, but in order to make money, everybody's had to increase leverage and increase debt, because that's how the system continues to expand, right? And so the slightest little wobble in the growth of debt and leverage will cause the whole thing to collapse. And that's where I like your slide of the dominoes starting from a small one can end up toppling the large one. That's really what we're talking about, is any wobble in the expansion of credit and leverage will bring the whole system down. And then ultimately that will undermine the value of our money, quote money, the currency.
That's exactly it. And not to be negative, there's a giant illusion going on here, and a false sense of belief and trust. And I think you had a recent article, Charles, on the history of the Titanic, and how everybody, it was unsinkable, and the trust that was built into it. But there was a whole number of flaws in the thinking behind it, that it was really the technology wasn't keeping up with it. I think you outlined about the steel and the sulfur content, right? On it. That's kind of what we have here too. The problem with collateral is that inherently it is defined by wealth versus money, and there's a difference between wealth and money. Collateral is about real wealth. Money is only a promissory note. It's an IOU effectively. So, but wealth can only be created by either growing it, mining it, or building it. It can't be printed into existence. When money is no longer a store of value, which is what is beginning to happen now, then it loses its perception of wealth, of being wealth. And it's about what they call, the economists have long called, the illusion of money. And the illusion of money actually maintaining a store of value and being wealth. It's not wealth. That's at the root of this collateral problem today. We're not creating wealth at a sufficient rate, and it's actually at an insufficient rate, to match the need for real trusted collateral. And nobody lends money without some form of collateral or guarantee. And the whole system is a credit-based system today. That's the exposure and bringing this down. More money is just a temporary illusion. And that's what's going on with QE4, etc. We're playing all sorts of games with money and its debasement as measured by inflation. And everybody says, well, we don't have inflation. We have inflation. If you have got tuitions, you got medical bills, you know what you're starting to see, or services that are going up. Because games are being played, such as the basket that you use in your CPI, or they use for the COLA for your Social Security. There are things such as substitution, hedonics, imputation. If you're a statistician, you'll realize how you can distort dramatically both the growth rate in GDP for one reason or another, or the inflation. And what I'm linking there is the deflator that's used to bridge inflation into the GDP. So in conclusion here, Charles, is that the investment challenges for the 20s in an era of global conflict will be to anticipate all of this and handle it. And what you have to be able to handle is the reaction that's going to start to unfold in this era of conflict, and this situational analysis that we've kind of went through here for a while, just this morning here, is the radical policy extremes that we've seen and will accelerate and be worse going forward. The changing rules. Politicians will always change the rules. They'll move the goalposts. They don't solve problems typically. So the laws are going to change, the regulations are going to change, taxation is going to change, and you have to be ready, prepared, and know the ramifications of those, along with these policy extremes. You need to be preparing for the disruptions that you can anticipate and possible shortage that comes out of those disruptions. I'm not saying we're going into a Mad Max era or anything like that, but this is what's going to come with an era of conflict and chaos. And most importantly, is figuring out how to maintain your real capital. And as Joey, the famous 1930s comic Joey Lewis said, it's not the return on capital that keeps him up at night, it's the return of his capital. And there's never going to be a time that's more true of that than going forward in this era of conflict. Comments, Charles?
Yeah, I think this is a very good structure for us to look at the future. And we're experiencing right now, as we record this session, the disruption that's been unleashed by the coronavirus in China. And the full effects are, of course, completely unknown on supply chains and financial assets in China and many other issues. But I think that it's typical of the kind of dynamic that we're trying to discuss here, which is the overall global financial system is really fragile beneath the surface. And that was my Titanic analogy. Was the Titanic was presented as unsinkable, but it had a lot of fatal flaws, and there were fatal flaws in the systems that were supposed to be uh, safeguarding the lives of the passengers and crew, even if the impossible happened. And so that's this unleashing of uncertainty and instability from the coronavirus. It's indicative, I think, of the systemic weaknesses that you and I are trying to describe, but that are invisible to the vast majority of conventional analysts.
Yeah, we think we have total control of potential pandemics and epidemics, and what we've seen here is we don't, as a global society, right? Look how quickly it got out of China, and how the quickness on which it's growing. And whether it's this or something, this is to be anticipated. And when you have a fragile system, as we clearly do right now, something will force it to be tested. And hopefully the system will be able to accept that. I question that it can. I really do. And I question whether our politicians have the foresight and capabilities and agreement between countries to even come up with solutions, as we did with the Bretton Woods conference after the Second World War, where we restructured for a whole new world order that we had to move towards. So with the coronavirus, picking on it, as you point out, it could have devastating effects, because what has saved the world here for 15 years has been the explosive growth of credit out of China, frankly. I mean, it's not that the rest of the world hasn't been creating it, but we would have had a test of an unbalanced global economy sooner if it hadn't been for the explosive growth of China. And now it's going to have to be tested, like we did the U.S. economy in 1929, when we retested to see, because we'd overextended credit, we'd overextended borrowing and expansion, and we had to come back, and we suffered some very tough times in the 1930s. And if it wasn't for an era of conflict called the Second World War, we might not have been out of it as quickly as we did. I'm not saying a world war may be at the end here, but I am saying, as we proved in this series, an era of conflict is dead ahead because we've never solved the underlying political, financial, and economic problems that we laid out in the very first one of this part one of this three-part series. Charles, any concluding comments as we wrap up?
Well, I think you have a chart here that's we can only touch on, which is the non-fiat currencies, which is, if we're talking about an ultimate loss of trust in fiat currencies, which can be basically created out of thin air in limitless quantities, then we can anticipate a turn to non-fiat currencies, which cannot be printed out of thin air in unlimited quantities. And so your slide here has gold and precious metals, black gold, which would be oil, and cyber gold, the cryptocurrencies. And I just want to sort of end my contribution here by talking about trust, which you mentioned earlier. And when people talk about cycles, which we did, they say, well, how can a cycle have any reality? You guys are just applying this idea of a cycle to a bunch of random data. But what that perspective misses is human psychology remains in wetware 1.0, right? And so we forget what happened in crises. We think we assume we have the tools and knowledge to counter any kind of disruption. And so we get overconfident. We have a lot of hubris, and then we overextend things that worked to the point where they don't work. And that's really where we're at in terms of the global financial system. So your last slide is very important because we can all anticipate rising interest in non-fiat currencies because they have more trust. In other words, gold and oil are actual commodities. They are physical realities. And the cyber currencies like Bitcoin have a level of trust because they're not controlled by a central government or a central bank, and their protocols are decentralized and therefore trustworthy, at least more trustworthy than a fiat currency. So that's another trend we can talk about in a future program, but I think that's a critical element and dynamic going forward.
This is all leading towards a fiat currency crisis at some point. It's not imminent, but it's coming. Because when you move yourself away from sound money, and this whole concept of the illusion of money, and that is sound money says that money no longer becomes a store of value. You're on a destructive road that has never ever been reversed without a collapse in the currency and a replacement of it. But it does take a while, and we're in that process right now. It's not imminent. It can be, but it's in this whole melt up we're now seeing in the markets, which is clearly in my mind, a government-driven Ponzi scheme of asset inflation by excess and historic levels of liquidity being pumped in. It's like pumping more and more air into a balloon that has a leak in it. And you can keep pumping air in, but that leak and that rip in the balloon keeps getting bigger and bigger. And then suddenly, no matter how hard you're pumping, that balloon collapses because the hole suddenly becomes, all the air goes out through the hole. But it's amazing how long, if you've ever done that, even if you've got a hole in the balloon, how long you can still pump it as the hole gets bigger and bigger. So you never know when that rip's going to be the final rip. Charles, got a break. We'll talk again next month.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gordon.
Can you tell our listeners where they can see and read your work, especially your new article on the Titanic?
Yeah, please visit me at up2minds.com, and you can look at my recent work and download free selections of my books.
Thank you very much, Charles. Talk to you later.
Okay.